Lenora Fitch was 31 years old when her brother-in-law put her out of the house she had built with her own hands. Not with a fight, not with lawyers or papers, or any of the machinery that might have given her something to push back against. Just a Tuesday morning in the last week of October, frost on the window glass, her sister Dora standing in the kitchen doorway with her eyes on the floor, and Clem Fitch on the porch with two of Lenora's bags already set beside the steps. "The place is Dora's," Clem said. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the near post of the porch railing, the one Lenora had replaced herself 3 summers ago when the old one rotted through. "Always has been, and we need the room." Lenora looked at her sister. Dora did not look up. She had been living in that house since her parents died, 11 years prior. She had kept the kitchen garden, repaired the fences, re-chinked the north wall of the barn when the wind started coming through in winter. She had done all of it because Dora could not do it, and their parents had asked her to stay on, and she had stayed. She was not a woman who left things unfinished. She was also not a woman who made scenes on front porches. She picked up her bags. She looked at Clem's face one final time, the set jaw, the eyes still fixed to the side of her, and she catalogued what she found there. Not cruelty exactly. Something smaller and more common than cruelty. Convenience. The simple human preference for what was easy over what was right. She did not say goodbye to Dora. There was not, in that moment, a goodbye in her. She walked east, toward the one place she could think of that nobody else wanted. Their grandfather had homesteaded a parcel in the draw east of town, a narrow strip of land along Calvert Creek that the family had let go to scrub after he died. Everyone agreed the ground was too rocky, the tree cover too dense, the drainage too poor to be worth farming. Their father had said as much every time the subject came up. The county assessor had knocked the value down twice in 15 years. When Lenora had read the old land survey at 18, just after her parents passed, she had noticed something the assessors and her father had not thought much about. The eastern corner of the parcel, where the limestone bluff curved around to block the prevailing north wind, and the creek ran shallower over bedrock, had soil that was a different color than the rest. Darker, more moisture retention. A south-facing slope that would catch light from late morning through late afternoon, even in the short days of winter. She had stored that observation the way she stored most things that might someday matter. She had not known, at 18, that she would need it. She needed it now. If you're watching this from wherever you are tonight, drop your city in the comments below. What you're about to hear is something I think you need to see through to the end. The draw was worse than she remembered. The scrub oak had come up thick in the years since anyone paid attention to the property, and the creek had rerouted itself slightly after what must have been a high-water event, leaving a gravel bar across what had been the main access path. She had to walk the creek bank for a quarter mile before she found a place to cross without soaking her boots. But the eastern corner was there exactly as the survey had described it. The bluff curved, the slope faced south, and when she pressed her hand to the earth in the hollow below the bluff, the soil gave slightly under her palm, darker and denser than the gravel ground she'd walked across to reach it. Her bags had 4 days of food in them. She'd packed them herself, quietly, 2 nights before, because some part of her had understood what Tuesday morning would look like before Tuesday morning arrived. She had not told Dora she was packing. She had not told anyone. She had seeds, too, a tin from the pantry shelf, the one she'd stocked herself, and that Clem almost certainly didn't know the contents of. Winter wheat, a handful of dried bean seed, wild onion bulbs she'd dug from the creek bank in September, without any particular plan in mind beyond the instinct she'd always had for saving things that might be useful. She set her bags against the base of the bluff and looked at the hollow in the late October light. The light was thin and going. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since noon. She had a lot of work to do before dark. The first shelter was not shelter by any generous definition of the word. It was a lean-to of cut scrub oak, propped against the bluff face, filled in with dead bracken, and weighted with stones along the bottom edge to keep the wind from getting under it. It kept the rain off her head. It did not keep the cold from getting through at the sides, and she spent the first 2 nights not sleeping so much as enduring, in short intervals between periods of waking, to add wood to the fire she'd built at the lean-to's mouth. She was not a person given to despair. She had noticed this about herself over the years, sometimes with gratitude and sometimes with a detached curiosity, as if she were observing a trait in someone else. The darkness did not take hold of her the way it seemed to take hold of other people in hard circumstances. She thought it might be because she was congenitally more interested in the immediate problem than in the situation that had produced it. The situation was what it was. The problem in front of her was wood, water, shelter, soil, and time. She worked the soil in the hollow for 3 days before she planted anything. The top layer was good but shallow, underlaid with clay about 8 inches down. She had no commercial amendment. What she had was the creek gravel, which she worked into the clay layer to improve drainage, the ash from her fire, and the leaf litter accumulated against the base of the bluff, which was several inches deep and had been composting in place for years without anyone to harvest it. She mixed these in proportions she worked out by feel and by the dark knowledge of someone who had been turning kitchen garden soil since she was old enough to hold a trowel. Her mother had been a practical woman who taught practical things without ceremony, and soil was the first thing she'd taught. The wheat went in on the 4th day, in shallow furrows along the south-facing slope where the light would hit it longest. The beans she held back. Beans were for later, for spring if she was still here, for the deeper soil she intended to build by then. The wild onion bulbs she tucked into the narrow strip along the base of the bluff, where the rock held warmth from the afternoon sun even after the air temperature dropped. She had read once that the Osage had done something similar along limestone formations in this part of the country, working with the stone's heat retention properties for early spring planting. She had read it the way she read most things, not because she needed it then, but because she had a habit of keeping what she found. She was building from nothing, but she was not building without knowledge. Those were different things. The town of Alderville was 2 miles west of the draw, by the creek road. She had grown up there. She had milled grain there, taught Sunday school there for 3 years after her parents died, mended the harness leather for half the farms in the county, because she had learned the trade from her father, and it needed doing, and nobody else was doing it. She knew the faces of its 340 residents the way you know the landscape you've walked every day of your life, completely and without particular sentiment. She did not go back to Alderville. There was no law against her returning, no formal exile, no council meeting, nothing so dramatic as what had been done to her. Just Clem Fitch, putting her bags on the porch steps, and Dora not looking up from the kitchen doorway, and the knowledge that the whole of a small town has a way of arranging itself around whatever version of events is easiest to accommodate. Clem would have told his version. Alderville would have found a way to accept it. She was not interested in contesting the story. She was interested in the soil temperature in the hollow below the bluff. The first person to find her was a man named Jonas Webb. He came through the draw on horseback on the 11th day, following the creek for reasons that had nothing to do with her. He ran a small trap line through this stretch of scrub and had done for several years. He pulled up short when he saw the lean-to and the fire, and Lenora, kneeling in the dirt of the hollow, measuring the depth of the frost line with a stick. He was maybe 50, lean in the way of men who spent their winters outdoors, with a face that had been weathered past the point of easy reading. He sat on his horse and looked at her work without speaking for a moment. She looked back at him without moving. "You're Lenora Fitch," he said. "I am." He looked at the lean-to. He looked at the turned earth of the planting strip. He looked at the ashen gravel amendment she'd been working into the clay subsoil at the hollow's lower end. "That corner's been fallow since your grandfather died," he said. "I know. Ground's supposed to be no good." She looked at the slope, at the position of the bluff, at the color of the soil she'd turned. "The assessor hasn't stood where I'm standing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. His horse shifted its weight, and he brought it steady without looking at it, the automatic adjustment of someone who has spent a great deal of time on horseback. "I heard what Clem Fitch did," he said. He said it without particular inflection, the way people in small counties report facts they have already organized their feelings around. "Word travels, always does." He paused. "You all right?" It was a direct question, and she gave it a direct answer. "I'm working. That's close enough." He nodded once. He was the kind of man who accepted that answer without needing to do anything with it. She appreciated that. "I'll be through here again in 10 days or so," he said. "Running the line. I'll be here." He rode on. The wheat broke ground on the 17th day. Lenora was crouching over the planting strip at first light, doing her daily check of the frost depth when she saw it. A pale green push against the dark soil, the size of her thumbnail. Two blades, together, leaning toward the south light. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. She sat back on her heels and looked at the seedling for a long time, longer than was strictly necessary to confirm what it was. She had grown wheat before. She had grown it every year of her adult life in the kitchen garden on the Fitch property. She knew what a wheat seedling looked like. This one was not remarkable except in the fact of its being alive in ground that everyone in 2 counties had agreed for 30 years was not worth the effort of planting. She made a mark in the small notebook she'd been keeping, a log of soil temperatures and amendment ratios and frost depths. She noted the seedling's position in the row, its angle toward the light, the condition of the surrounding soil. Then she got up and went to gather wood for the morning fire. But something in her chest had shifted, and she knew it, and she was careful not to look at it too directly yet, the way you are careful with something fragile until you are sure of it. The lean-to became a proper shelter in the 3rd week. She had found a stand of down timber further up the draw, old-growth oak blown over in some past storm and dried where it lay, which was better lumber than anything she could have cut green. She worked it with the small handsaw she'd had the presence of mind to pack, splitting and notching by hand, and built a 3-sided structure against the bluff face, with a sod roof packed dense enough to hold heat. It was not pretty. The east wall was 2 inches out of plumb, and she knew it and could not entirely correct it without taking the whole thing down and starting over, which she chose not to do. It kept the wind off. The bluff behind it absorbed the day's heat and released it through the night. In the mornings, the inside temperature was consistently warmer than the outside air, by a margin that surprised her the first time she measured it, and no longer surprised her after that. She had, without fully intending to, chosen the best possible site on a parcel everyone had written off as worthless. Jonas came back on the 10th day, as he'd said he would. She had not expected him to come early, and she had not arranged her life around the possibility of his coming at all. He arrived to find her waist-deep in the improved amendment plot at the lower end of the hollow, working a second bed to extend the planting area, and he tied his horse to a scrub oak and came down to where she was working without invitation and without apology, the way practical people enter working situations. "More seedlings," he said, looking at the original planting strip where 7 wheat blades were now visible. "9, she said. 2 more came up this morning." He crouched down and looked at them with the focused attention of a man who knew grain. He pressed 2 fingers into the soil at the edge of the planting strip, worked them to the second knuckle, withdrew them and rubbed the soil between his thumb and forefinger. "Better structure than I'd have expected," he said. "Took 3 weeks of amendment." "What did you use?" she told him. He listened without comment, which she had already begun to understand, was how he listened when he was taking something seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, still looking at the seedlings. "Town's not doing well," he said finally. She waited. Early cold snapped the corn harvest 2 weeks short. The Aldrich brothers lost most of their winter stores to a roof failure. There are 4 families going into this winter, with less than half of what they need. He paused. Clem Fitch is on the council now. He's been telling people the shortfall isn't as bad as the older farmers are saying. Lenora looked at the 9 wheat seedlings. She looked at the second bed she'd been turning, 8 feet of dark amended soil ready for planting. She looked at the bluff above, which caught and held the October sun for 6 hours a day even now. She did not feel satisfaction at the news of the town's difficulty. She noticed this about herself clearly. She felt something more complicated than that, a kind of anger at the particular architecture of how things had fallen, and underneath the anger, against her will, a concern she recognized as genuine. "How short," she said. "Bad enough that people are talking about it quietly and not talking about it publicly, which usually means it's worse than the talking admits." She looked at the soil in her hands. She thought about the second bed, the south slope above it, where she'd been planning an extension planting, the limestone formations further up the draw that she'd been meaning to examine more carefully. "When you come through next time," she said, "how far out of your way is it to ride through town?" "Quarter mile. When the wheat is ready to harvest, I'll need empty sacks if you have them." He looked at her. He looked at the seedlings. He had the expression of a man updating a calculation he had already been running. "I'll bring them," he said. He brought them, and more. On his next pass, he arrived with 2 empty grain sacks, a small packet of salt wrapped in brown paper that he set on her supply shelf without comment, and information. 2 of the 4 families in the worst condition were ones she knew well. The Aldrich family on the North Road, 4 children, the oldest barely 12, and old Marta Caussell, who had been widowed in August and was living on the charity of neighbors who had little enough themselves. Lenora processed this without reaction, the way she processed most information, visibly calm, internally already running the arithmetic. The wheat in the main bed was coming in faster than she'd expected. The South Slope Amendment was holding. She had begun a 3rd bed in the lower hollow, where the creek deposited silt each high water, rich dark alluvial soil, that needed almost no amendment at all, just clearing and turning. The wild onions along the bluff base were coming up faster than she'd dared hope, dense and healthy in the thin strip of warmth the rock provided. She was not going to have a surplus. She was going to have enough, and enough more than enough, which was not the same thing, but was something. "Don't tell anyone where it comes from," she said when she gave Jonas the first sack of cut wheat. "Not yet." He looked at her. "If people know the source before the food gets to the families," she said, "some of them will have feelings about the source before the children have eaten. Let the food get there first." He was quiet for a moment. "That's probably right," he said. He picked up the sack with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood what it had cost to fill it. "I'll go direct." He left at the hour that would get him into town before dark. It was the 3rd delivery that changed things. By then the wheat bed had regrown past the first cutting. The silt bed in the lower hollow was producing greens she'd started bundling alongside the grain, and the onions along the bluff had spread into a second natural colony that she'd been expanding carefully outward with divided bulbs. She had more food coming out of that hollow than she'd believed possible when she first pressed her hand into the dark soil in late October, and Jonas was running out of explanations. "I found a winter cache," he'd told people the first time. Then he said he knew a homesteader east of the draw who'd had a strong late harvest and wanted to share. By the 4th delivery, people were asking questions he could no longer answer sideways, because 4 sacks of wheat and 3 bundles of winter greens were not things a person found or borrowed, and the town knew it. "It's time," Lenora said when Jonas told her. He pulled off his hat. "Some people in that town are going to have trouble with this. I know. Clem Fitch is one of them, and he's on the council. I know that too." He looked at her with the direct measuring look she had come to expect from him, the look of a man assessing a situation he has not yet fully calculated. He's going to have to stand in the street and tell people that the woman he put out with 2 bags in October has been keeping his neighbors alive all winter. Lenora thought about Clem's face on the porch steps, the jaw set, the eyes to the side. She thought about what it had cost her to pick up those bags and walk, and what it had built in her, and what that building had made possible. She thought about the Aldrich children and Marta Caussell. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them all of it. Tell them where the food came from and who grew it and how." Jonas was quiet. "They need to know the source is reliable," she said. "And they need to know so they can learn to do it themselves. That's more important than any of the rest of it." He nodded once and went. The news came back in pieces, the way news from a small town always does, assembled from fragments rather than delivered whole. Jonas reported each visit over the following weeks, and Lenora built the picture from what he brought. The Aldrich family had accepted the food without question. The oldest girl had apparently looked at the bundled greens and asked her mother where they came from, and her mother had told her, and the girl had said nothing for a moment, and then said, "We should write her a letter." She had written the letter. Jonas brought it on his next pass. It was in a child's careful handwriting and said that the soup was good, and that she hoped Lenora was staying warm, and that her little brother liked the onions, which was surprising because he usually didn't like onions. Lenora read the letter twice and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, and did not read it again for some time, though she was aware of it there. Marta Caussell, according to Jonas, had cried when she learned the source of the food she'd been receiving. He relayed this with the slight discomfort of a man who is uncertain what kind of crying it was, and considers it outside his territory to interpret. The harder reactions came, as she'd expected, from the council end of things. Elder Pruett, who had seconded the motion to appoint Clem to the council in the fall, had apparently needed a day alone to process what he'd been told. though what he did with the day Jonas couldn't say. Two of the other council members had gone very quiet in the particular way of men who cannot find a reasonable position from which to be angry about something that is keeping their neighbors fed. And Clem Fitch had stood in the middle of the main road and listened to the account Jonas gave him, and had not said a single word throughout, and had walked home afterward with the gait of someone carrying a weight they've only just calculated the full measure of. Lenora heard all of this and kept it in her head alongside the soil amendment ratios, and the frost depth records, and the growing counts from the hollow. She did not sort it yet. She let it sit. It was Dora who came to the draw. Lenora heard her before she saw her, the sound of feet on the creek gravel, moving with the uncertain pace of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. She was in the lower hollow turning the silt bed when Dora appeared at the hollow's edge and stood there without coming down. She looked thin. She looked like someone who had not been sleeping well, which was different from the way she had always looked in the old house, where she had seemed perpetually elsewhere, even when she was present in the room. Lenora set down her trowel. She did not go to her sister. She waited. Dora came down the slope carefully and stopped a few yards away and looked at the beds. The wheat stand in the main strip, the onion colony along the bluff, the silt bed with its dense winter greens. She looked at the shelter structure against the bluff face, the supply shelf inside the door, the fire circle and its arrangement of cooking stones. She looked at all of it for a long time without speaking, and Lenora watched her look and understood something from the quality of the silence. Dora finally said, "I didn't know he'd already packed them. The bags he'd set on the porch steps, the bags he had packed the night before while they were all under the same roof." Lenora said nothing. "I found out afterward," Dora said. "He told me you'd agreed to go, that you'd both talked about it and you'd agreed it was best." She paused. "I knew that wasn't true, not the way he said it. But I didn't." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I didn't say anything, and I should have, and I don't know how to fix that." The hollow was very quiet. The creek ran over the gravel bar in its small, constant way. "You can't fix it," Lenora said. She said it without particular harshness as a statement of fact. "It's done. The only question is what you do from here." Dora looked at her. She looked at the wheat bed. She looked at the child's letter, which was pinned to the supply shelf beside the trowel rack. Her expression did something complicated. "Clem," she said. She stopped, started again. "Clem is not going to say anything to you. He is not capable of saying what needs to be said. I know that about him. I know it too. But Dora's voice went uncertain in a way that was unfamiliar, and Lenora recognized it after a moment as the sound of someone saying something they have not said before and are not sure will hold together in the saying. "I'm sorry. I'm saying it because it's true, and because someone has to say it, and because you deserve to hear it, even if it doesn't fix anything." Lenora looked at her sister for a long moment. The same face she had known since the beginning of her memory, always at some small remove from the present situation, always slightly elsewhere. Not the same, now. Present in a way she hadn't seen before. She thought about what it would cost her to receive this, and what it would cost her to refuse it. "I know," she said. "I know you mean it." She went back to the silt bed and picked up the trowel. "Help me turn this section if you're staying. It needs a second pass before I can plan into it." Dora was quiet for a moment. Then she took the spare trowel from the rack without being asked and came down into the bed. They worked without talking for most of the afternoon. The light went long and low over the bluff. The wheat stood in its rows, pale and definite against the dark soil. The creek ran its small course over the gravel bar at the hollow's edge. At some point, Dora said, "She would have known, you know. Mama. She would have seen what you were doing before you understood it yourself." Lenora kept turning soil. "She used to say, the land tells you what it wants to do. You just have to be willing to listen before you tell it what you want from it. She said that to me once. I didn't understand it then. I didn't either. Not fully. Do you now?" Lenora pressed her hand flat against the turned soil of the silt bed. It was damp and cool and gave slightly under her palm, the particular give of ground that had been worked correctly and was ready to receive. "Getting there," she said. Jonas came back the following week with news that surprised her. 3 people in town were asking about the growing method. Not the council, not Elder Pruitt or the older families who had been farming the same ground the same way for 40 years. 3 of the younger women, Ada Kerrigan, whose husband had broken his leg in September, and left her managing their kitchen garden alone through the fall. A widow named Petra Sohn, who had been farming a quarter section north of town since her husband died 5 years back, and Marta Cossel's granddaughter, who was 17 and had apparently announced to her grandmother that she wanted to understand how you grew food through a frost. "They want to come here," Jonas said, "not to be helped, to learn." Lenora looked at the hollow, at the 3 beds, at the bluff with its thermal wall, and the south slope with its 6 hours of winter light. She looked at everything that had been built in this place in 10 weeks from 2 bags, and a tin of seeds and the soil knowledge her mother had given her. "Send them," she said. "But tell them what they're coming for. They're not coming to be shown something impressive. They're coming to do the work, and the work is specific, and it's hard, and it takes longer than seems reasonable before it produces anything." Jonas almost smiled. It was a restrained expression, mostly in the eyes. "I'll tell them. Tell them to bring tools, what they have. We'll make do." Ada Kerrigan arrived first, on a Thursday morning, carrying a good trowel and a solid hoe and the focused, slightly defensive expression of a woman who is determined not to be daunted by something that daunt is currently the appropriate response to. She looked at the hollow, at the beds, at the bluff. "Show me the soil first," she said. "Start with the soil. I've been fighting clay my whole life, and I need to understand what you're doing with it." Lenora liked her immediately for that. She spent the next 2 days teaching, not demonstrating, not explaining in the abstract, teaching, the way her mother had taught her, with high expectations and no condescension, and the specific generosity of someone who has learned that knowledge becomes more useful the further it travels from the single person who holds it. She walked Ada through the amendment ratios, the layering method, the difference between drainage amendment and nutrient amendment, and why you had to address both separately. She explained the bluff's thermal properties, and how to identify similar formations, the particular color of limestone that retained heat well, the orientation to look for, the vegetation patterns that indicated protected ground. She showed her the frost depth records and the germination counts, and explained what each meant in practical terms. Petra Sohn arrived on the 2nd day, quieter than Ada, but with questions that went deeper. Technical questions about soil biology, about the interaction between ash amendment and existing soil pH, about whether the method could be adapted to the heavier clay on her north section. Lenora answered in full and asked her own questions in the back, about the north section's drainage slope, its exposure, its existing plant cover, and they talked through the adaptation together in the particular focused way of 2 people who are finding out they understand the same problem from different angles. Marta's granddaughter, a girl named Vesta, arrived the 2nd afternoon and said almost nothing the entire 1st day, just watched and worked when she was handed a tool. On the morning of the 3rd day, she asked a single question about whether the onion bulbs could be divided mid-season or whether dividing in fall was essential for the spring colony to establish properly. It was a good question. It was the question Lenora had spent 2 weeks figuring out the answer to by trial and error. She answered it fully, and then she looked at Vesta's face and saw in it the same quality she recognized in herself. Not enthusiasm exactly, but the specific hunger of someone who has found a thing they are built to understand. "Come back next week," Lenora said. "I'll have the division method written down for you to take home." Vesta nodded once and went back to work. When they left on the 3rd afternoon with arms full of notes and seed starts, and the soil amendment ratios written out in Lenora's careful handwriting, she stood at the hollow's edge and watched them go. She was aware of something she had not expected to feel, not pride exactly, something quieter and more durable than that. The particular satisfaction of having used yourself correctly, of having brought your full knowledge to bear on a real problem with real stakes, and found that the knowledge was sufficient, and then found a way to make it transferable. She went back to work. Clem came to the draw in December. She heard him before she saw him, the same way she'd heard Dora, feet on the gravel, deliberate and slow. He appeared at the hollow's edge and stood there the way people stand when they have rehearsed the walk but not what comes after it. He looked worse than she expected. Not from cold, he was dressed adequately. From the inside, his face had the gray quality of a man who has not been sleeping, and he had lost weight in the way that big men lose weight when they stop eating properly, which made him look diminished without looking smaller. He came down into the hollow and stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at the beds. He looked at the bluff shelter, the supply shelf, the tool rack she'd built from scrub oak branches. He looked at the wheat in its rows, which was on its third cut now, growing back faster than the first time, the soil fully established, and the germination cycle reliable. He looked at all of it, and she watched him look, and she understood from the quality of his looking that he was understanding, for the first time, what she had built and what it had cost, and what it meant that she had built it here from nothing, while the town he sat on the council of went hungry. He didn't say anything about what he was seeing. She didn't ask him to. 4 families are still short, he said. His voice had a flat quality, as if he had stripped it of inflection deliberately. The Aldrich stores won't last to February. He stopped. Breath. I've been telling the council the shortfall is manageable. I was wrong. I've been wrong about that since October. She waited. I'm not coming here to explain myself. What I did in October. He stopped again. His hands curled at his sides, not in anger, but in the way of someone who cannot locate the right grip on a thing. I packed those bags the night before I brought them to the porch. The night before. I want you to know I understand what that means. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I didn't understand it then. The hollow was very quiet. The creek ran its small sound over the gravel. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because saying I'm sorry isn't enough, and I know it isn't enough, and I didn't want to come here and say it, and have you think I believed it was enough. She held his look for a long moment. She thought about October, the frost on the window glass, Dora's eyes on the floor, the porch post she'd replaced herself 3 summers ago. She thought about the 3 weeks of amendment work before the first seed went in, and the 17 days of waiting before a single blade came up, and what that waiting had felt like in the cold. She thought about the Aldrich girl's letter in the pocket of her coat. I know it isn't enough, she said. I'm not waiting for enough. She picked up the trowel she'd set down when she heard him coming. Tell me the actual numbers, what each family needs, what they have, how long the gap is, he told her. He told it the way a man gives an accounting when he's decided the only remaining honest thing he can do is be accurate. Names, quantities, estimated duration, what had already been done and what hadn't worked. She wrote in her notebook while he talked. When he finished, she did the arithmetic in her head, which she had always done faster than on paper, and looked at the beds and the shelf and the third cut coming in and knew what was possible. I'll need the sacks brought to Jonas's first cabin, she said. He knows where. He can run the distribution because people trust him and they know his route. She paused. Send someone who knows which families are proud about it and will refuse before they'll ask. The Aldrich girl's mother, probably. Leave the food at the door early, before anyone is up. She'll take it in. He was quiet. Can you do that? She said. Yes, he said. Then do that. She turned back to the bed she'd been working when he arrived, and after a moment she heard him come to stand beside her, not asking permission, not offering himself exactly, just present and available. That section needs turning, she said, and nodded toward the upper end of the silt bed. He bent down and began to work. They did not speak much for the hour he stayed. It was not comfortable, and it was not resolved, and it was not pretending to be either of those things. When he left, he carried what she could put together that afternoon. 2 sacks, a bundle of greens, the dried onion she'd been preserving in the shelter. He walked up out of the hollow with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been given a specific task and intends to do it exactly right, as if precision in the errand is the only form of reparation currently available to him. She watched him go. She stood in the hollow as the light went flat and low, and the temperature dropped toward the cold that would come with dark. The wheat stood in its rows. The bluff held its heat against her back. The creek ran on. She thought about Dora turning soil in the afternoon quiet. She thought about Vesta's single good question and the look on her face when she received the answer. She thought about Ada Kerrigan saying, "Show me the soil first," with her good trowel in her hand. She thought about her mother's saying, "The land tells you what it wants to do," and she thought that it was true of more than land. People, too, told you what they were capable of if you were willing to watch long enough and without the burden of wanting them to be different than they were. She was not a woman who forgave easily or performed forgiveness she did not feel. She was also not a woman who confused the absence of resolution with the inability to continue. The 2 things could coexist, the anger and the work, the grief of October and the wheat in its rows. The sister who had finally said what needed saying and the brother-in-law who had said what he could say, and left the rest honest in its inadequacy, all of it true at the same time, none of it required to cancel out. She added a piece of wood to the fire and let it catch and turned back to the silt bed. Spring came the way it comes to the high-draw country, not all at once, not with ceremony, but in accumulation. Degrees added to the morning air, the creek running higher and louder with snowmelt. A morning in late February when she walked out of the shelter and heard a bird that had not been in the draw since autumn, its sound sharp and purposeful in the cold, and she stopped and listened and understood from it what the season was deciding. She thought about going back into Alderville, not to reclaim something, not to stand in the main road with whatever account the town owed her. What had been done was done and would remain done, and she had never been a woman who mistook the desire for justice for a plan of action. What she thought about was the south meadow at the edge of the Kerrigan property, which Ada had described to her in detail during those 3 teaching days. A south-facing slope above a limestone shelf that sounded like a larger version of what she was standing in. The potential of it, what it could do under right management, in the hands of someone who understood the soil logic she'd been developing all winter. She thought about Vesta and the division question. She thought about Petra Sowain's technical precision and the north section with its heavy clay. She thought about the knowledge in her notebook and what it was worth only to her versus what it was worth distributed. She went down on the first day of March. Jonas walked with her. He had offered, and she had accepted without making anything of it, because he knew the road and she had been out of the habit of Alderville for 4 months, and there was no reason to enter it alone when someone was willing to walk alongside. The town looked the same from the road above, and different when she walked into it. The same in the way small places are always the same. The layout, the buildings, the particular quality of winter light on familiar streets. Different in the way places look when you have been away long enough to see them, rather than simply recognize them. Ada was at her gate. She had apparently been watching for movement on the road. She came through the gate and walked toward Lenora without ceremony and said, "The south meadow. I've been measuring the slope. You were right about the formation. I haven't seen it yet. Come see it this afternoon. I'll show you." It was not a warm welcome or a dramatic one. It was a practical woman talking to another practical woman about ground they both understood something about. Lenora found it exactly sufficient. Petra Sowain was further up the road and raised a hand in greeting when she saw them coming. She fell into step alongside without being asked and said without preamble, "The north section. I tried the drainage amendment the way you described it, and the drainage is changing already. But I have a question about the second layer. Ask it." She asked it. Lenora answered while they walked. She saw Dora at the corner of 2nd and Main, standing in front of the dry goods store with a basket in her hand. Their eyes met. Dora looked at her steadily, without looking away, and Lenora gave her a nod, which was honest. It was not forgiveness, and it was not distance. It was the acknowledgement of a woman to her sister, who had said what she could say and had meant it, and who would have to live in the same complicated space as that truth for a very long time. Dora gave a small nod back. Clem was at the far end of the street. He was standing in front of the council building with 3 other men, talking. When he saw her coming, he said something brief to the other men, and they dispersed, and he stayed where he was. He was giving her the choice of approach, which was the right thing to give her. She could pass him at distance, she could acknowledge him and keep moving, she could do any number of things. She walked toward him. He looked older than October. Not more worn, exactly, more inhabited. As if the thing he'd been carrying since December had settled into him in some permanent way, like a stone in a wall, uncomfortable but structural. She stopped a few feet from him. "The south meadow," she said. "Ada Kerrigan's property. The limestone shelf above it. Do you know the formation I mean?" He considered. "The one with the overhang. That's it. I want to put a cold frame operation there. Larger scale than the hollow. It'll need people, real workers, not council members, people who can turn soil and follow instruction and put the time in. I need them committed before the ground thaws." He looked at her face. She let him. "Thomas Aldrich knows ground," he said. "He farmed the river bottom for 15 years before he came up here. Good. Him and 2 others who can work." A pause. "I can make that happen. Make it happen by the end of the week. The ground thaw waits for no one." He looked at her for a moment longer. His jaw moved. She could see that he wanted to say something that was not about the meadow or the workers, and she could see that he could not yet find the form for it. "You sound like your mother," he said. It came out quietly, without calculation. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table with the seed catalogs and the soil notebooks. She thought about everything she'd been left that she hadn't known she was being left. The knowledge given the way provisions are given, practically and without ceremony, by someone who loved her enough to think ahead. "Good," she said. She was usually right. She turned and walked back to where Ada and Petra were waiting at the head of the road, talking about slope orientation, and she walked into the middle of that conversation and let it take her. The cold frame went in on the South Meadow in the second week of March. It was Lenora's design, Thomas Aldrich's labor, and Vesta's soil preparation. The girl had a precision with soil amendment that reminded Lenora of herself at 17, which was both gratifying and slightly unsettling. Within 2 weeks, there were 8 people working it. By the end of March, it was 12, and the questions had gotten more specific and more technical, which was how she knew the learning was actually happening and not just being performed. Ada had started a separate notebook of her own, recording ratios and germination counts in her own system. Petra had solved the north section problem with an adaptation that improved on Lenora's original method for heavy clay and had told her so directly, and Lenora had written it down and said it was a better solution. She kept the hollow. She had never thought she wouldn't. She went back every third day through the spring to tend the beds and record the continuing data, because the hollow had taught her things she was still working out the full implications of, and it was also just her place. The thing she had built out of nothing in the worst 4 months of her life. She was not going to abandon it because she had also built a life in Alderville again. Both were true. Both were hers. She moved between them, without drama, the way she'd always moved between the things that required her attention. The hollow in the morning, town in the afternoon, the South Meadow twice a week, the notebooks filling up on both ends, the hollow records and the meadow records, and eventually a third notebook that was neither. That was about what she was learning from teaching. The way explanation required a deeper understanding than practice. The way other people's questions found the edges of her own knowledge and pushed them further out. Dora came to the hollow twice more in March. They worked in the same space without resolving things, because there was no version of resolution available that was also honest, and Lenora had no interest in the dishonest kind. What they had instead was presence, the particular quality of shared work in a place that had been built out of necessity and had turned into something that mattered. Dora learned the amendment ratios. She started helping in the silt bed without being asked. It was not comfortable, and it was not simple. It was a true thing between 2 people who had been sisters their whole lives and had failed each other and were still sisters. Lenora thought it might be enough. Jonas Webb kept his trapline. He kept coming through the draw every 10 days through the spring, and then less frequently as the need to carry food one direction dissolved into something more mutual. Sometimes he brought news. Sometimes he brought something from town that she'd needed. Sometimes he just tied his horse and came down into the hollow and sat on the shelf at the shelter entrance and drank whatever she had hot on the fire. He never made a project of it. He never said anything directly about why he came or what he thought it meant. He was not a man who said things directly when the thing was already clear. He had come looking for her in October and not expected to find her, and he had found her, and he kept coming back. Lenora did not require a further account than that. The child's letter. Ada Kerrigan's daughter wrote it. It turned out, not the Aldrich girl as Jonas had assumed, stayed in the inside pocket of her coat through all of it. The soup was good. Her brother liked the onions. She hoped Lenora was staying warm. She had been warm. Warmer than anyone had expected her to be. The wheat grew in its rows in the hollow below the bluff, and the onion colony spread along the limestone base, and the silt bed in the lower hollow produced into the summer, and then she seeded it again for fall, because that was the nature of ground that had been properly amended and properly tended. It kept giving if you kept working it. It asked for attention in return for production, which was a fair trade, and also, she thought, most of what was true about anything worth building. The hollow was still there the following winter, and the winter after that. The cold frame on the South Meadow was there. The knowledge she had put into 12 pages of handwriting, and then into 2 notebooks, and then into the hands and heads of the people who had come to learn it, was out there in the ground of the county, working without her direct involvement, feeding people through seasons she had not been there to supervise. That was what she had wanted, not the account that was owed her, not the version of events corrected and distributed, not even forgiveness in any clean and satisfying form. She had wanted the knowledge to keep working after she'd done the work of it, in ground she hadn't touched, in hands that had learned from hands she'd taught. The land tells you what it wants to do. You just have to be willing to listen. She had listened. She had also answered back, and the ground had given her everything it had, which turned out to be enough, and then more than enough, which was the only surplus that had ever mattered to her.